Okay, welcome back to the Investigative Journal on this February 29th, 2016 day on our calendar. I'm your host, Greg Anthony. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. You can listen to my show every evening from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. That's on FirstAmendmentRadio.com or at 11 a.m. Pacific Time. And if you can't watch either of those or listen to those shows, go to my website at arcticbeacon.com, arcticbeacon.com. I thought today, since our show is on the day after the Oscars and a movie called Spotlight won the Best Picture, that I'd go back to an old interview I did in 2007 with Jim Rothstein, a New York police investigator. Now, Spotlight is a movie based on true events, recounting the incredible investigation team at the Boston Globe and how they uncovered a massive scandal of child molestation and cover-up within the Catholic Church back in 2001. The flick stars Mark Ruffalo, Rachel Adams, and Michael Keaton was in that movie, and Liev Schreiber. Now, anyway, this scandal regarding you can go see the movie, won Best Picture, brings to the forefront to the American people that there is this huge pedophilia problem in the Catholic Church. I don't know why the politicians aren't bringing this up at the presidential debates, unless they work for the Vatican somehow. Now, the question I'm saying is, in 2001, this has been going on for hundreds of years. There's much, much more than just this Boston Globe story. Now, I'm going to tell you that in 2007, I'd interviewed Jim Rothstein. I interviewed him before that many times. And he's a New York investigator. We're not going to just talk about the pedophilia problem, but also about child trafficking and the Vatican's connection. So why don't we just go to Jim and listen to what he has to say.
Steve's back on the line. We had a problem with the phone. I introduced him earlier, and we'll get right to him now. Jim, how are you?
Good morning. I'm fine. I guess we had some technical difficulties.
Yes, we did, but I did give you your introduction so that people understand who you are, a former New York police detective who's been very courageous to stand up to the very people I'm talking about now, and you know exactly where the evil lies. You found out about it when you were on the streets in New York. Why don't you just recap that for us? We're going to get into two things today, the pedophile problem and also Frank Sturgis and the Kennedy assassination. So go ahead, Jim.
Yes, I became a police officer in New York in February of 1965, and I worked the streets in Times Square as a uniformed cop. And while I was there, I started observing all these girls being brought into New York for prostitution. And what eventually happened is a plainclothes cop was killed by one of the pimps. And because I was the only guy who had any files, I was brought into the investigation. And that got me started on the thing with the girls being thrown in and used around the United States. And then we investigated. Finally, we got into the pedophile end of it with the boys. And that took me to anything and everything in this country. We were able to infiltrate the entire subculture of this. And as you know, it went into the Vatican and every other thing you can imagine in our country and around the world. That's basically how I got started in all of this stuff.
And I'm going to talk about some of the particulars, but I also want to mention this. You have such interest, your evidence is very solid. It's eyewitness evidence. It talks about priests that were on the good side, on the bad side. It talks about how they infiltrate the government, the mafia, the whole works. And it never gets told anywhere. I mean, your story gets out on shows like mine, and that's why I bring you on more than just once. Because what they'll do normally in a case like this, when it really gets down to the nitty-gritty, they'll just ignore you and allow it to be said once and then forgotten. As Americans and most people just, are quick to remember for the first day or two, but then it just leaves. So I want to bring this message back so people understand. And if you've heard Jim say these things before, perhaps you need to hear it again. And if you haven't heard it, send out the archives and everything to as many people as you can. Because, Jim, your story is very credible, and it's sad to me to see We should have been listening to you 25 years ago, and it shows just how corrupt this country really is for a long time. Don't you agree?
Yes, that is very true. And you know what has happened because of shows like yours? For the first 30 years that I worked this, you could not get anybody to do anything. Even the reporters who wanted to write the stories, the Daily News in New York, the New York Times, they could not get the story out to the public. But with the internet and shows like yours, and you've done more than most, we have been able to get the message out. And as a result, many, many other things are coming forward that verify the things that I investigated 40 years ago and to the present time, which I'm still doing.
Yeah, and so I'm going to leave it up to you. Tell us, people want to know who are the real powers behind the New World Order in our country. Now, there's so many problems, so many things have happened. We've had we have, of course, the pedophile terrorist problem that you talk about. Then we look at all the other terrorist events that are going on, all the other scandals in our country. But tell us what you found out as far as the real powers in this country through this story that you are investigating. Go ahead.
Well, what basically happened was I got an informant who was supplying the little boys to the United Nations, and he was known as Dr. Rockefeller. Okay. And I was given the assignment by an inspector who happened to be a very honest man in the New York City Police Department. As you know, in the 70s, that wasn't really a well-known thing. But as a result of this, I arrested a man by the name of Ben Rose. Ben Rose was a pharmacist on the east side of New York, not far from the United Nations. And I never forget the day I went to arrest him. Well, I should go back a little bit how we got him. We actually had got... Yes?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
And what happened was we caught him with 3 little boys that he had kidnapped or taken out of Maryland. Unbeknownst to anybody, we didn't even know that these kids were missing, but we observed them. And when we went to arrest them, I wore a wire expecting to be bribed. It didn't happen. Instead, he turned over as what we call a guy turning over. He became an informant, and we arraigned him without anybody knowing it. So he was clean as an informant, and nobody knew he'd been put under arrest. With that, we infiltrated and were able to get into this whole subculture where they use children to compromise people. And you'll find in many of these things, we can go back to the Vatican business and all of that. Most of this is accomplished by compromising people, using little boys or girls and getting these people in a compromising position, people in high authority, and then they have them, and they can make them do whatever they want to do.
And who are the people behind this that you found through your informants?
Well, usually they're a bunch of power brokers. Most of the guys that supply the kids are people who, many of them have been victims themselves, and then as they get into it, become perpetrators and start kidnapping other kids and using them in the process. The compromise is one thing, and then you have the extortion that goes with it. These are generally very sharp con guys on the street, and they're used. They're used by, for instance, our intelligence people, which is now well documented when you get into the Frank Olson case. For your audience, he's the guy that was experimenting or used with the LSD and jumped out of a window in a hotel in New York as a suicide. It turned out later, and it was the last I heard, an open murder investigation where they admitted that they were running 3 houses of prostitution. Plus, as you know, I had grabbed one of their people when they killed 3 little boys, 2 14-year-olds and a 15-year-old in my informant Ben Rose's apartment on East 64th Street in New York. So that is just a quick, how would you say it, opening to how this stuff gets started.
Right, and I want to get into the top dogs in this. You said earlier, and I really want our listeners to concentrate on this aspect of the story because there's so much disinformation out there, and I think we need to start talking about the real top dogs here outside of our government officials who are just puppets in this whole thing. We're going to get back and do that with Jim Rothstein right after this short message on the Investigative Journal. Okay, we're back. My guest is Jim Rothstein, a former New York police detective, and I mean, he has come forward with so many interesting aspects of what's going on in the New World Order. Jim, you told me before that you found out through Vatican insiders and informants and other people in New York that former Cardinal Spellman was one of the most evil men and one of the most powerful men in this country. That when people listen to that sometimes that don't understand this story, they can't get their head around the fact that a religious leader could have so much political and other influence in our country's domestic and foreign policies. However, you learned that. Now you say it's in the hands of Egan, Cardinal Egan, who's in New York. So tell us about this whole story, which also involves John Paul I, the former Catholic priest, Father Ritter of the Covenant House. Go ahead. We'll start now and then continue in the second half hour. Go ahead.
Well, what happened was that I had another informant who used to supply the little boys to Cardinal Spellman. And what he did was give me one of the boys who had actually been caught, and it was reported that he stole the Cardinal's shoes, and it went to court, and he was known as Jack the Sailor. And what they did is he went to court and forgave this poor young man for having such indiscretion and all this, but what it was, it gave me the backing I needed so that Spellman couldn't come after me. Because of the investigations we were doing, we're going into the church, very heavily into the church, and at that time, usually, it was pretty well covered up because you did not go after the church. Well, about 1978, when John Paul I was made Pope, and I was present when he ordered Father Bruce Ritter and gave him a special dispensation to clean up the pedophilia in the church and the Vatican bank scandal that was about to break, which was very high echelon. And as you know, this did not happen on its own. There was a concerted effort both by the intelligence community, the Americans and the Russians, to infiltrate the church and subvert what they were doing. And that's how the pedophilia really got started. But when Ritter was ordered to do this, 10 days later, the Pope was dead. And we had gotten an informant out of the Vatican at the time, a young boy. We never did find out his real name, but I've heard in the last 2 years that he has died. Anyhow, with this informant, we found out, and we were told that the Pope had actually been murdered because they didn't want the pedophilia in the church cleaned up. And just so your audience knows, I am a practicing Catholic and always have been, and so it's not that I'm on a witch hunt against Catholics. That's the first thing you hear. You're after it. Well, my opinion, a criminal is a criminal. I don't care what he's wearing. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does, and it makes it clear, because that's the first thing that many people will say is that you have a vendetta against the Catholic Church. So yeah, let's clear that up so that you don't. But anyway, let's get into what you found out about Spellman and then also Ritter. What happened to him? Because he was a key player in this whole thing, which exposed a lot of the corruption leading into the Vatican and also being protected by our intelligence agencies and also involving many of our politicians. Go ahead.
Well, what happened with Ritter was once he got going, on 2 occasions I had been assigned to investigate Ritter. Once when he first started on the east side of New York, and he only had a couple of kids he was taking care of. And I was assigned to investigate to see what he was doing. And I found out he was squeaky clean. The guy was doing a little legitimate job and helping kids. So somebody suspected then already that this would be a problem. And then the second investigation was done a couple of years later when he first got to where Covenant House is located at the time, in the 70s on 8th Avenue and 44th Street. And eventually, when I got to know Ritter, was like the third time I was sent in to investigate him, and that's when we started working with him and to clean this mess up, because my informant came from Father Bruce Ritter. And Ritter, the minute that he went after this, he started getting a lot of heat. And there was a time where we had public hearings in New York. They were televised, and every major station covered it, and we had all the girls testify, and Ritter was leading the charge. He testified. And but that was the beginning of the downfall, because Ritter had files from every kid that came in there into the Covenant House, and there were thousands. So he had all these files with all the pedophiles and stuff named in it, because these kids would tell him. And that's why he became a very dangerous man to the powers to be. And one of the last things that happened to me, I was approached by the Monsignor in the police department that if I would compromise Bruce Ritter, I'd get promoted. Instead, I retired. So Ritter had done a tremendous job. And you ask about Spellman. Spellman was very, very powerful. Plus, he knew where all the dirty laundry on everybody was, too. And
all right, listen, we're going to take a... Jim, I have to take a short break. Let's continue right where we left off, right after this short break on the Investigative Journal. Just a little bit of problem with RBN's archives right now, so the owners there are working to get that straightened out. Secondly, go to my website at arcticbeacon.com, and I'm running a pledge drive, so please help me out. Help me out and raise some money to keep people like Jim Rothstein on the air, because as you know, the big advertisers do not want these stories out either. They're in bed with the media and also the criminals that we talk about, that is our government, along with all the puppet masters at the top level, which include the Vatican and the Jesuit order, that are conveniently left out of most every discussion when we talk about this. But anyway, and that's beyond comprehension to me, that this story, with all the evidence that we've got gathered just on this show alone, with limited resources, I might add, recapturing history, lost history about Vatican intrigues and corruption, and to leave them out of any debate about what's happening in this country is something that I can't comprehend. And anyone who doesn't put it on the table and discuss it needs to reconsider what they're doing in the field of journalism. Now, I might add this too, that it's very simple. People say, well, how can you say this about such a group? And I say this: they're either doing evil or they're either evil, they're good. And I can't find any good things they do outside of their front organizations of Catholic charities, things like that, which are conveniently put out there. But when you look at the serious problems of our country, they're on the opposite side of almost every one of them. Immigration, the pedophile problems, all the other things that are going on here, even covering up 9/11. They are in bed with our politicians and backing the war in Iraq silently. It's amazing to me. So, if they are good, why aren't they doing anything good? It's very simple. Back with Jim Rothstein. Jim, you left off, and I just conveniently just led right into Cardinal Spellman. Well, tell us about, what you found out. Fine, I know you started telling us, but continue on, because it ended up in destroying Ritter, and basically they tried to bribe you, too, with $1 million a couple times, and finally you had to leave the police department. Go ahead. Are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, that is true. They've tried everything to get me to lay off, and I wouldn't do it, and eventually I was retired. But Spellman, and while we're on that, I just want your audience to know that I could not have done this work without the cooperation of some very good priests like Father Bruce Ritter, Father Paul Marcus, and the list goes on and on. Because there were truly good priests, and there still are, who want this stuff broken up. It's no different than when I was a cop. When I found a crooked cop, to me he belonged in jail. And that's just like the decent priest. Any decent Catholic who thinks that these people shouldn't be punished cannot be a Catholic, because criminals are criminals. It don't make any difference how you dress them. And this is my flaw. It's just like Spellman. Spellman had everybody, the church... and what he did, he knew who was weak, and he used it to his advantage. They made fortunes. Probably the biggest real estate owner in New York at one time was the Catholic Church, and it hasn't changed much since then. And since Egan got in there has not been one exposed pedophile ring in the Manhattan, and yet it is the most decadent of
Right.
So you can see how this whole thing works.
Right. And another thing I wanted to emphasize was you were actually, when Pope John Paul I called Father Bruce Ritter, you were actually present hearing this, correct? It isn't something that you heard hearsay, right?
No, I was present with my partner at the time, another detective who is now deceased. We were physically in the office when he received that call. So it's not something I heard. This is firsthand. I was there.
And then Ritter, he's told by the Pope to clean up the pedophile ring in the church and outside of the church. And 10 days later, he's conveniently murdered. And it had to do a lot with this, a lot to do with his stance on uncovering the corruption in the Vatican Bank, and also exposing. And I happened to be in Rome 2 years after this when I found out he was trying to expose a list of high-level bishops and cardinals who are actually Freemason members, which is basically, if you look at canon law, it's a charge. It's contrary to the canon law, and it's a charge that leads to excommunication. But he found hundreds of people, including Father Marcinkus from Chicago, members of the P2 Lodge in Italy. So that was why he was killed 33 days after, and that's an interesting Illuminati number, after his papacy began. I think, tell us about Ritter, because this shows, I think, categorically that they're involved, and they tried to shut him up. And tell us really what happened to him and how he ended up a broken man in upstate New York.
Well, what happened was he was falsely accused by two young men who I knew, and these people, in fact, what they did, they waited till I left the state of New York, because they knew that if I was still there, I would have gone to bat for Ritter. But they falsely accused him of molesting him. And I know these two guys. They're liars and everything else. There were a couple reporters in New York who knew it and did write some stories. But they forced Ritter out. And Ritter, first he went, I believe, to Pakistan or India somewhere, and they followed him over there and totally destroyed him. And then I did send him a letter, and I received an answer. And in that letter he tells me about how he often wonders about our conversations, and he coded it because he knew he couldn't get anything out and tell the truth. And he told me he was a broken man and there was nothing he could do anymore. And I tried to rally him, but it was too late. He was finished. He totally destroyed probably one of the greatest men our country has ever seen. He probably did more and saved more kids, but they destroyed him because they couldn't have him. It's a sad case of affairs when this is allowed to happen, and nobody came to back him.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then in your case, tell the listeners again about how they tried to bribe you on 2 occasions, and finally how you were warned that either you lay off and retire, or perhaps you'll never receive another paycheck again. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, in one occasion, we were summoned, me and my partner, to a bar, and when we got there, 2 suitcases were put in front of us. Each one of the suitcases had $1 million in it, and my partner took a bundle of the $100 bills out and threw them out in the middle of the floor, and I threw my suitcase on the floor, and we got up and left, and he turned a corruption complaint in on me, and I turned one on him, and I don't think anything was ever investigated because I'm sure people knew where it came from. And then finally, the Monsignor tried to get me to compromise Ritter, and he said
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the left-behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Okay, we're back for the second half hour of the Investigative Journal, and let's continue our interview with former New York Police Detective Jim Rothstein.
Decent priest, any decent Catholic who thinks that these people shouldn't be punished cannot be a Catholic, because criminals are criminals. It don't make any difference how you dress them. And this is my fault. It's just like Spellman. Spellman had everybody, the church. And what he did, he knew who was weak, and he used it to his advantage. They made fortunes. Probably the biggest real estate owner in New York at one time was the Catholic Church, and it hasn't changed much since then. And since Egan got in there has not been one exposed pedophile ring in the Manhattan, and yet it is the most decadent of all places in the world. There are probably more pedophiles per square foot in New York than anywhere else, but you don't hear anything about it.
Right.
So you can see how this whole thing works.
Right. Another thing I wanted to emphasize was you were actually, when Pope John Paul I called Father Bruce Ritter, you were actually present hearing this, correct? It isn't something that you heard hearsay, right?
No, I was present with my partner at the time, another detective who is now deceased. We were physically in the office when he received that call. So it's not something I heard. This is firsthand. I was there.
And then Ritter, he's told by the Pope to clean up the pedophile ring in the church and outside of the church. And 10 days later, he's conveniently murdered. And it had to do a lot with this. a lot to do with his stance on uncovering the corruption in the Vatican bank, and also exposing, and I happened to be in Rome 2 years after this when I found out he was trying to expose a list of high-level bishops and cardinals who are actually Freemason members, which is basically, if you look at canon law, it's a charge. It's contrary to the canon law, and it's a charge that leads to excommunication. But he found hundreds of people, including Father Marcinkus from Chicago, members of the P2 Lodge in Italy. So that was why he was killed 33 days after, and that's an interesting Illuminati number, after his papacy began. I think tell us about Ritter, because this shows, I think, categorically that they are involved, and they tried to shut him up. And tell us really what happened to him and how he ended up a broken man in upstate New York.
Well, what happened was he was falsely accused by two young men who I knew, and these people, in fact, what they did, they waited till I left the state of New York, because they knew that if I was still there, I would have gone to bat for Ritter. But they falsely accused him of molesting him. And I know these two guys, they're liars and everything else. There were a couple reporters in New York who do it and did write some stories. But they forced Ritter out. And Ritter, first he went, I believe, to Pakistan or India somewhere, and they followed him over there and totally destroyed him. And then I did send him a letter, and I received an answer. And in that letter he tells me about how he often wonders about our conversations, and he like coded it because he knew he couldn't get anything out and tell the truth. And he told me he was a broken man and there was nothing he could do anymore. And I tried to rally him, but it was too late. He was finished. He totally destroyed probably one of the greatest men our country has ever seen. He probably did more and saved more kids, but they destroyed him because they couldn't have him. It's a sad case of affairs when this is allowed to happen, and nobody came to back him.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then in your case, tell the listeners again about how they tried to bribe you on 2 occasions, and finally how you were warned that either you lay off and retire, or perhaps you'll never receive another paycheck again. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, in one occasion, we were summoned, me and my partner, to a bar, and when we got there, 2 suitcases were put in front of us. Each one of the suitcases had $1 million in it, and my partner took a bundle of the $100 bills out and threw them out in the middle of the floor, and I threw my suitcase on the floor, and we got up and left, and he turned a corruption complaint in on me, and I turned one on him, and I don't think anything was ever investigated because I'm sure people knew where it came from. And then finally, the Monsignor tried to get me to compromise Ritter, and he said I'd be promoted to first-grade detective if I got him out of the picture, and I didn't go for that. And then finally one day they told me I could get a disability pension, and I knew what the OR was, so I put in for my disability, and I was retired shortly thereafter.
And that was a veiled threat on your life, is what they were doing.
It's not hard to figure out what that means.
Yeah, and it's just incredible. Now, you've continued on. I just wanted to tell my listeners right now that you can call us at 800-313-9443 if you have any questions. Jim's going to stay with us for the second hour, and we're going to concentrate in the second hour on Frank Sturgis and the Kennedy assassination and what you learned about that. That's an interesting story. And let's finish up, though, now. After you left, you still talk about, still help people with this serious problem, calling the pedophile problem the biggest terrorist threat in our country. Go ahead. Tell us about what you're doing now.
Yes, I was never allowed to retire because people knew I was out there and they kept calling. And the latest stuff is the Johnny Gosch case, which is just wide open. And we also have the Franklin cover-up, which came out of Omaha, Nebraska. And as we speak, there is work being done there, and there's been some new developments, just amazing things that are coming out. And that's why we need your audience. There's a lot of people in the audience that know what's happening, and we need help. And it looks like we finally got something going that we can expose this. On the Noreen Gosh, the Johnny Gosh kidnapping, we have somebody sending us photographs from when he was kidnapped while he was being held, and now we're starting to get pictures of perpetrators with kids. The missing and exploited children people said they have been working on it, but we really haven't seen the results yet. So things are, it looks like we might be getting a break, but we need more than that.
Right. Tell us a little bit about the background of the Gosh case and when these pictures came to light and why you consider it to be the biggest breakthrough in any one of these pedophile cases. Go ahead.
Well, what had happened was, I've been working on this almost 40 years, and I got involved with the Johnny Gosh case when he was first kidnapped because it was just another case that fit into the profiles that I was watching. And about 10 years ago, I finally got to talking to Noreen Gosh when I received some information that Johnny was still alive and had been spotted in Wisconsin in a motel room with one of my informants. And since then, I got to know Noreen quite well. And eventually, a man by the name of Jimmy Gibson came forward. This was about 7 years ago, and we started working on getting some pictures. Here about, I guess it's 9 months ago, Jimmy Gibson, with the help of Tim White, came forward, and we actually got photographs of Johnny Gosh when he was kidnapped, within days, because he was still wearing the same clothes, and two other boys that were also there, and another photo that showed a man with a ligature around his neck, apparently dead, who we only assume was one of the perpetrators. Now, this has set off quite a firestorm. And as a result of this, we have been getting some people sending us more pictures that are out there showing all these kids being molested. At the same time, I have been working on another batch of photographs in Omaha, Nebraska with the Franklin cover-up thing. Now, the Franklin cover-up and the Johnny Gosh case are the same people. And in that case, there was available for me for 48 hours bunch of pictures, but because they actually showed perpetrators messing the kids up, having sex with them, it would have been child pornography. So, and I didn't have anybody backing me to go pick those pictures up, because if I'd have got caught with them, they'd have told me I had child pornography. But they disappeared when I couldn't make it, so they're still available if I can get going again to get those pictures. So that's some of the things that are happening there.
Yeah, and you said one time that not one case that you've ever worked on over the years has ever gone and, to the, really the investigation has never really got to the top levels, and it's always been stopped. Please tell us about that. Include our good prosecutor in New York, Morgenthau, as far as covering up a lot of these cases. But that's really important, because once you get to a certain point, it never gets any farther. Go ahead.
Yes, that is a fact. In fact, there was a case in November of 77 where we found the man running basically the largest ring at the highest level in the United States at 230 Central Park West in New York City. And they raided the place. The district attorney's office at the time raided the place to get the files, because our informant had set the whole thing up. We actually had an informant in the operation. And when they got wind of it that we were going to take it, they went and busted it, seized all the files so that we couldn't continue our investigation. And we knew what the files were because we had an informant in the operation. So that just shows you how that happens. And we did have one case where we went to the top, where we convicted 11 of the 12 top pimps in the United States with the girls. So it can be done. But all the other cases that I have followed since then, and when I was a detective and after that, they will go so far and then the cases disappear. And this is what I cannot believe in this world should happen. How can people of this country allow this to happen? They should demand to know, where does this lead to? Look at the Franklin cover-up. They took Larry King, the guy that was running it, but he was not the main guy. Henry Vincent, they took him. He was a supplier. But these are only low-level people. How come these investigations didn't go any further? This is the question that the people in our country have to start asking so they can protect their children. I just within the last year and a half had a man come forward who had done an investigation in the intelligence community where they found that 834 kids had disappeared into this subculture between 82 and 89. And how can, that's 834 children. But there were actually 1,500 cases. But only these were the cases where the guys just disappeared. And
that's just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak.
That's right. And why, if they had this information, why didn't anybody investigate it? This information is there now. When these pictures on Johnny Gosch came forward, I personally met with the police authorities in West Des Moines, Iowa, and nothing has happened. Not a thing. And we were able to trace the websites back to the people that put them on where these pictures came from. How come the police can't do it?
Yeah, good question.
It always reminds you of the time they found 3 contaminated grapes on a ship coming out of Venezuela. I don't know if you remember that or not. Years ago.
Go ahead.
But they can't solve it. Well, they had a ship. They found these contaminated grapes on it, and this was among hundreds of shiploads of grapes, but they could find 3 grapes, but now they can't find all these kids disappearing. There's something wrong.
Yes, Jim, we're going to take a short break, come back, call us 800-313-9443. Back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal. Or on the Investigative Journal, my guest, Jim Rothstein, a former New York police detective. Jim, you also said that, you also said that you had some photos, or one photo of George H. Bush in a, what's that all about, anyway?
There is a picture that shows him, and it supposedly came out of a library where somebody took a picture while they were there. You know, you can't leave with anything. Berger got caught doing that, taking it out of somebody's professional library, but evidently they had a cell phone with them and took a picture of this picture, and it showed Bush with 2 young boys who are believed to be Johnny Gosch and Paul Benassi, and we were trying to get somebody back in to get a clear photo of it or find out where it was and get it with the Freedom of Information Act. So the picture isn't clear enough to definitely say that what it was, but Noreen has identified the one picture as being Johnny. So that's the picture that we're still working on.
Okay, now, tell us about Morgenthau in New York and how he has been really trying to stop any type of investigations. He's the district attorney there.
Well, again, I go back to the case that I talked about on Central Park West, where we had this big pimp or procurer, and he was running a book out of there, supplying kids to the highest people around. And he went to it and jumped it because I personally was in front of him, face-to-face, asking for a wiretap because we would have been able to get everything that was going on. And as soon as we left, he sent his guys out there to bust the place so we wouldn't get the files, and we never got the wiretap. That was just one of it. And if you look at New York now, how many cases have happened? This was since 77 till now. How many big cases have been busted in New York? I haven't heard of any. They do their routine stuff, but the big ones don't go down. And I find that quite interesting, and I think everybody should ask that question.
Yeah, and just relate this to, what you found, what's going on in our country now in the last minute here on this segment. And next segment, next hour, I want to get into Frank Sturgis and the Kennedy assassination that you learned about when you tried to arrest him. Tell us what your thoughts are right now about what's happening in this country and how this pedophile problem relates to the whole big epidemic of the downfall of America.
Well, this is, as we were told by Harold Laswell, who was a Freudian scientist who used that through the history of the world, this has happened a number of times. And if the people don't do anything, in particular, he said, if the mothers of these children don't want them protected and make their men do what they're supposed to do, or the fathers do what they're supposed to do to protect their children, it'll destroy this country. And if you look at what's happening, how many kids are disappearing? You just had a case the other day where an illegal alien allegedly kidnapped a young boy down in Florida. So it's going on all over the country. And you hear these great people get on television, but I don't see anybody coming forward. For instance, if there's anybody in your audience who has a politician either on a state or federal level, if there's 4 laws that could be passed.
Jim, hold that thought. We're going to get into those 4 laws right after this short break on the Investigative Journal. Now let's get started on the Investigative Journal today. I've got a great interview with Jim Rothstein, a former New York police detective who's been with us before. And Jim has found out so many things regarding the New World Order, terrorism in our country, through working as an investigator on the New York Police Department for years. He's retired now, and he'll talk about that also. Jim, how are you today? Are you there?
No, why is that?
Jim, are you there? Hello? Jim, are you there? Well, we'll get Jim back on. See if you can get him back on. Welcome to the Tuesday, February 27th edition of the Investigative Journal. This month is really flying by, and we've got a great show for you today. Jim Rothstein, he's a New York police detective, is going to tell you the truth about the pedophile rings in this country, how he's tried to investigate those, and also we're going to talk about an encounter he had with Frank Sturgis, a.k.a. Frank Farini, who was involved in the Kennedy assassination, and this is going to be an interesting story because he's found a 22-page, or he's trying to get a 22-page confession that Sturgis gave, which really blows the lid off this, connecting Daddy Bush and others to the Kennedy assassination.
Okay, I'm going to have to fill up. We're back in 2016, and I was going to play the rest of that Jim Rothstein interview, but somehow it was not on the tape from 2007. Don't worry, I can go back. I've done a number of shows with Jim, and so we can go back and get some more. But anyway, let me fill in some gaps here from 2007 till today. This story regarding the pedophilia ring in the Catholic Church has now reached even to a Hollywood movie. I haven't seen the movie, but it talked about the Boston Globe investigation into the pedophilia ring and how the Catholic Church and their hierarchy was covering it up from officials so that these priests could not be arrested. And then these priests were sent to other dioceses, maybe in different countries, different states as well. So we know this exists, but the idea, what I was giving you here with the Jim Rothstein interview, was much, much more. We get into the child trafficking aspect of this, and you heard how Cardinal Spellman, who was basically the chaplain of our military, was deeply involved in that. And it goes on and on and on. So I wanted to bring that up because the story, I haven't seen the movie, but I probably just the tip of the iceberg. But it's also interesting that this made it to Hollywood, and also the Best Picture of the Year. Now, you know nothing ever happens without their approval. And prior to the Academy Awards, a big high-level cardinal from Australia came out and admitted that the Vatican has made many errors in this regard. Well, I think that's just the tip of the iceberg as well. And if we ever really got to the bottom of all the things that I talk about on this show and others who have investigated this stuff prior to me, and even after I've started it, it would be amazing the connections that could be made to most everything, not only pedophilia and child trafficking, but the control of our financial system, control of our educational system, the control of our political system, and the control of our media, all in the pocket of Rome. And if you don't believe me, I think a good place to go, instead of making false accusations, I think go to a website called concordat.org. Now, if you don't know what a concordat is, that's a legal agreement between the Vatican and a country and in the process, favors are given back and forth. Now, there's last count I had was 190 to 200 of these concordats all around the world. And it was amazing, many started to be implemented right after the fall of the wall of communism. Now, if you go to that website, start really looking into what they say about these concordats. Now, you realize that from the time of the Lincoln assassination, and I just played an old show regarding C.T. Wilcox and the truth behind the assassination of Lincoln and how the Jesuit order was involved in that. And it wasn't just a lone gunman. But we had dropped any kind of diplomatic relations with this organization in Rome until Reagan became president. Now, not that we weren't working with them behind the scenes, but basically what happened here is they basically reinstituted formal relations with the Vatican, and now we have, basically what is a Vatican office in Rome, etc., etc. And it's also interesting to note that the Office of Inquisition is now in San Francisco, headed by Cardinal William Levada. This is a first. Never before has this office been located in the United States or run by a American cardinal or bishop. And although they've changed the name of the Office of Inquisition to the Office of the Doctrine and the Faith, something very sneaky, so to speak, they're still doing the same thing. And just as I said, I'd love to get into the Vatican archives in Rome. I'd love to really wiretap that place. I mean, that's what the police should be doing. Start wiretapping where the real crime begins. Wiretap the Vatican. Wiretap the William Levada's office if you want to get some really juicy information. And if you want to go farther, go to the Cardinal of New York, Chicago, and L.A. and do that. Heck, you wiretap everybody else in America. They're basically doing nothing. Well, anyway, we're all out of time, and I'll get to more on Jim Rothstein, and I apologize for repeating some things, but we had a little difficulty on the old tape. We'll be back tomorrow on the Investigative Journal.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.